Today's conversation is brought to you by He Gets Us. How did the world's greatest love story become known as a hate group? That's the question behind He Gets Us, the largest national multimedia campaign to change hearts and minds about Jesus. Reaching over 1 million people daily, He Gets Us now helps connect local churches to the conversation. From discussion guides, Bible reading plans, and even a sermon series, you can now bring He Gets Us and the nationwide conversation to your church. Visit hegetsuspartners.com/NAE to get these free resources.
Today's conversation is the podcast of the National Association of Evangelicals. I'm your host, Walter Kim, NAE President. In these conversations, we seek to help evangelicals foster thriving communities and navigate complexity with biblical clarity. One area that touches on both thriving communities and navigating complexity is how we interact with social media, digital devices, and technological advances. Felicia Wu Song, a cultural sociologist of media and digital technologies, joins us for a wide-ranging conversation on personhood, connection, and formation in the digital age. Listen in. Felicia, it is so great to connect with you. It's great to have known you in the pre-social media world, and now to reconnect with you in friendship and collaboration this way is a real joy.
It's a real pleasure to be here with you, Walter.
Yeah, and this conversation in particular is something that impacts all of us, and often in ways that we can't quite grasp. So I'm eager to jump into things. And you come at this issue not just with kind of an academic and sociological lens, which of course you bring through your training, but you come at it through a deeply informed faith. So let me begin with that part. Describe a little bit more how your faith influences the questions you ask when it comes to technology, formation, and who we are.
Yeah. So what I am most interested in my research and scholarship is the way that technology impacts our experience of being human. Um, to put that in more concrete terms, I'm interested in how technology shapes the way we experience community, relationships, identity, what we think we're doing when we're forming our identity. And so when it comes to how my faith gets enmeshed in the way that I think about those things, I think it's actually quite integral. It's completely at the center of what animates my curiosity, because I'm oriented around the central understanding that God created us as human beings in a particular way, with particular um, a nature that is, as the church likes to put it, is in the image of God. So I'm curious about, well, what is that, right? Is that our relationality? Is that connected to the way that Jesus was incarnated in flesh, in a corporeal body, right? Like, what does all that mean to us and the way that we are to live into our human experience, and so therefore what happens when technology is kind of interfacing with that, right? And so the way we live into relationship or community or identity in the 21st century, right, in 2023, is going to feel different from what it was like in the 1970s or in the 1940s, right? Even though identity, community, relationship have always been a part of our human experience, what does it feel like for us now?
So in your book, Restless Devices, you discuss the reliance on technology, and specifically its potential to isolate us from this human connection that you're talking about, connection, relationships, image of God. Draw that out a little bit for us. I mean, this intersection, yes, positive things, perhaps, hopefully, but
Mhm.
also you talk about its potential to actually damage or isolate us. Work that out for us.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think our digital technologies today are fascinating and challenging to know how to live with, precisely because of what you said. It has so much potential to actually bring people together, to help people express themselves authentically, to bring people that are maybe geographically, spread in very different places, right? That can't and historically haven't been able to talk to each other, right? I mean, it's incredible, right? But at the same time, I think what I'm interested in and I'm curious about is the way that it's that the impact of technology is not just when we are actually using it. That is,
Mm,
when you and I are talking to each other at this very moment, right?
mm,
The impact of technology is much broader, it's bigger in the way that today, again, unlike how it might have been in the 1990s, if any of us might remember that,
mm,
what plugging into the internet was like then, it's very different now, right? And so, right now, we live in a time, and I think in the foreseeable future, where we aren't just using technology in a kind of light switch. It goes on, it goes off. Like I connect with you and then I turn it all off. It's no, no, no. We are living in a landscape, in an ecology is the word that I use, right? In an
mm,
environment that is actually completely enmeshed, infused with digital communications and informations because of our mobile devices, of our notifications, of all the different streams coming from work and family and friends and church, community, right? And so the result is that we live in what's called a state of permanent connectivity.
mm,
And what that means is that even though we might not actually be literally looking at a screen at a given moment, increasingly our consciousness is a part of our consciousness is actually dedicated to thinking about or waiting on that email or that post or that
mm,
notification, right? And so that this gets to your question about relationships, so that whenever I actually am engaged with someone, whether I'm having coffee with them or I'm standing and just talking to them, or even online, a part of my spirit and my being is actually kind of preoccupied,
mm,
knowing that something else is happening somewhere else. And very often we tend to think that that something else is actually more important
mm,
than the person that we're actually talking to. Right. And so it's that kind of um, chronic state of being um, uh, preoccupied, right, with
mm,
some other thing that's happening online, that is distracting us. That is, research is showing it's creating a an inability to actually attend to people,
mm,
and a lower sense of empathy with people when we're actually talking to them. And so, just in again, in that kind of very broad sense in which we are shifting in our everyday texture of how we go through life because we are permanently connected, it is transforming even the times when we are talking to each other. And that's not even to get into, and we can get into this, the way in which the digital industry is selling us a
mm,
very particular way of talking to each other and being with each other. And I would argue that way is shaping and distorting those relationships and our identities within those communities.
mm. That's very compelling description, one that I think all of us could maybe immediately imagine what this is, going through your day.
Mm,
And yes, you sent the text off. Yes, you posted something on Instagram. Yes, you put your phone down, but did you really put your phone down? Because as you're talking about it, it's still in the
mhm,
back of our minds. And that the way you draw it out, there are two things that strike me as and its implication for human relationships. One is that um, you noted that we are less able to connect with each other
mm,
because we're less present with each other. Even
mhm,
mentally, we're less present. We might even be sitting across from each other, and lovely moment in which we both have our phones down, but our phones are not down mentally. Like
mm,
they're still so okay, I get that. But this part of the empathy,
mm.
um, describe that a little bit more for me. It's not just that you're arguing, it's not just that we have something constantly
Mm,
running in our back of their minds that are draining us a little bit,
mm.
but you are saying it's impacting our ability to have empathy.
Yeah,
How is that working out? Because that the implications of those two are huge for human relationships.
yeah, yeah. So, Sherry Turkle writes, she's a social psychologist who teaches at MIT and has written wonderful, very accessible books on the role of technology, particularly in the lives of young people as they are forming their sense of self and forming an understanding of how to be in friendships and relationships with people. She writes about these studies that note this drop in empathy through the decades. And I think what's happening in part is the presence factor, as you mentioned, that we are increasingly um, not committed
Mm,
in some ways to each other in our spirits, right?
mm,
Because we are um, tending to the 50 snap streaks that we need to keep up on a 24/7 basis, right? But I think a part of the neurological aspect of empathy that I find particularly interesting is the way in which empathy um, is comes how should I put this, is cultivated out of a part of our brain that we actually don't let breathe and live out its capacity
mm,
very often, because it's the part of our brain that only, quote, turns on when we are bored, when we're not doing anything, when we're not filling our minds with stimulation and information or getting something done. um, it's that part of the brain that is dedicated to creating self-narrative, for reflection, right? It's the part, just, and that sounds all very scientific, but we all know this. Like you've had a conversation with someone during the day, maybe you had a conflict, and then you're just driving home, you know thinking about it, or you're in the shower and
mm,
you're not even thinking about it, right? You're just and then, but then there's this thought that comes to you, right?
mm,
It's like, oh, maybe this is what they meant. Like I took them to say this in a different way, or oh yeah, right. And it's because our brains, right, when we're showering or when we're driving, right, it's shifting into a different modality, right? And it's actually neurologically bound up, right, in our capacity to empathize, right? So when we are constantly on our phones, when we're constantly being stimulated by Netflix or reading the news, right, that part of our brain is not activating,
mm,
right? And so we aren't actually engaging in the empathy work,
mm.
right? It's not even getting a chance, right, to blossom and grow.
And you mentioned the kind of impact neurologically, um, but specifically on developing brains. So you've
Mhm.
already alluded to the, especially on young brains. So
Mhm.
um, Is there a difference in how this is impacting children versus adults? What are similar ways that technology,
Mm,
social media, our digital life, what are some ways that are similar
mhm.
between different generations? But what are some of the ways that
Yeah.
may be specific in our concerns for childhood development?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think there's still a lot of questions about what is happening to young people's brains as they are growing up in a world of screens, of social media apps, and in a world in which what it means to be a friend, what it means to have relationship with someone might mean being on a group chat or being on Snapchat or Be Real, right? Like, what is that? How is that forming their understanding of what friendship and trust and love looks like? I think all of those are real and open questions in ways that are perhaps different from older generations that did have formative years without this degree of technological enmeshment in our friendships and relationships. Um, with that said, one of the things I actually feel quite strongly about is that I don't think of technology as a young person's problem.
Mm,
I think that's a really easy cop out for
mm,
those of us who are older to say, oh, like this is just something for the youth group people to talk about, or
mm,
right. I don't think that at all. If again, if you look at the studies, the Gen X, the baby boomers, right? Like we're on social media just as much as the teenagers. We're
wow.
on different platforms. We do different things, perhaps, right? Um, but the screen time is actually not, we're not getting outpaced
Mm,
by the young people. It's different. It gets used differently, right? But I think the degree of dependence and also I would sadly say the degree of lack of reflection is actually quite similar across the generations. And that's understandable because we live in a society, in a culture that tends to fully embrace and celebrate technology. We aren't particularly skilled at or have much experience even in having public discussions, public conversations about um, the potentially negative or troubling aspects of technology, and we don't have a history of of economic regulation or government um, oversight over these aspects of our lives in the ways that other countries and cultures do.
mm,
So again, it's very understandable that we don't have a lot of mm, cultural or societal resources easily accessible, but I think that is starting to change.
mm.
And certainly we have moments when even now, right, with all the AI fury, right, there we have moments when people get very concerned. But I think in those times we need to um, be very thoughtful about what we are concerned about.
Mm. All right, you mentioned AI, and you also mentioned in previous comment earlier on about the impact that business has in promoting certain ways of consuming information, certain ways of reacting, and then the lack of oversight that we have as a society more generally.
Mhm.
Let's put some of those pieces together. What are the questions? What are the concerns that we should have when we think about um, the active agents, whether it's business or new
Mhm.
technology or
Mhm.
scientific endeavor?
Mhm.
Uh, what are the things that we should be asking when it comes
Yeah.
to those agents? Because they're not neutral. They all
Yeah.
have something that
Mhm.
they're seeking to do with this technology.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the most interesting aspects about the history of the internet is that when it was first invented and when the research was initially starting, unlike most inventions, most technologies, um, the business sector wasn't a part of the conversation. And so many aspects of the internet that we celebrate, the way in which it's decentralized, the way in which information can be free, quote unquote, right? The ways in which we can network with each other, all of that came out of other sectors, actually. And the business sector was actually rather skeptical about what the potential of the internet was. But once we hit the once Silicon Valley figured out and venture capitalists figured out how to make money off of the internet, and we're in the 2000s now, right? It shifted what the internet is. And so I think one of the key aspects of most of the technologies, the digital technologies that we have coming down the pike or that is already in our lives, um, one of the aspects we really need to pay attention to is the fact that it is deeply enmeshed in a commercial, commodifiable, right, endeavor. And that because there is big money in this, and that you have brilliant minds, truly brilliant, creative minds going into figuring out how to not just hook us onto a certain platform, right? Drawing on research from casinos, consultants, addiction consultants, right? Being fairly unabashed, right, about cultivating those addictions so that we will spend more time on particular platforms or apps in order to gather data from us, right? I think that's the part that most of us miss, right? We don't understand because we don't see it. It's kind of under the hood that we are giving off a lot of data. That's what companies are actually selling to advertisers and other organizations. That is where the connections between the social media apps and artificial intelligence actually, that's where the point of connection is, because artificial intelligence relies on data that is out there, that's being crunched through remarkable algorithms, right? All the machine learning is based on the data that we are collectively, right, giving off. And so the concern, I think, or the things we need to pay attention to in these active agents is that, we live in a time and in a society where, economic ends, there isn't much of a counterpoint to it at this, in conversations, right? The bottom line still tends to appear to be something that trumps ethical concerns, that trumps civic concerns. And so as a society, we haven't quite figured out how to offer a critique, right, that has moral authority, right, that will motivate an industry to say, hey, maybe we shouldn't just promote this technology to young people, or let all the voices be heard in this way, because we're making a ton of money, even if there are lots of societal or individual dangers that are trending fast, right? And so yeah, I think it's a huge, a big part of the problem is that as consumers who don't understand the technology, and it takes so much work to understand it, right? I mean, these companies aren't making it easy at all, right? It's not like in the old days when we had a car that you could tinker with, right? Or a radio, right? That you can actually lift the literal hood and right? Even today's cars, you can't tinker with them, right? You lift it and you see this digital, right? It's digitized. And so you're like, I don't, yeah, what am I supposed to do? And so as consumers, I think it is difficult for us to get information about how the industry works, but I think it needs to that conversation needs to enter our communities, so we just have a better understanding of what our consumption means to these industries.
So we've covered some ground that talks about um, formation of the brain,
Mm.
impacts on community, human relationships, society as a whole, all of which touches upon aspects of being created in the image of God. But I want to focus more specifically on faith.
Mhm.
What is the impact of all this on faith formation? How we even understand our relationship with God and life in the church?
Mm. Yeah. Um, I like to think about our relationship with technology in terms of the habits that we have. Um, the habits, especially the ones that, the real habits are the ones that we don't even realize we're doing. And so um, the work of Jamie Smith has helped me think through this. He talks about how many of the habits that we cultivate in our society are function like liturgies. He calls them secular liturgies, right? They train us, they train our hearts towards a particular love, particular way of or a particular vision of the good life, right? Of who what we're what this is all about. And the problem is that so many of our secular liturgies, i.e., many of our digital habits, checking my phone every moment that I have a break, um, when I'm tired, checking my phone, when I'm upset, checking my phone, right? All of those habits arguably are actually discipling us away from the kingdom of God, um, discipling us away from following after Jesus. And so I think for people of faith, and I'm using the word discipling in a very purposeful way, I really do believe that our digital habits are training us and teaching us certain things about how to respond to hard times, things that are uncomfortable, but also teaching us what it means to be a good friend, um, which could look like, especially increasingly now for young people, having to respond instantaneously after a message or a text, um, and training us in ways that, and other people have said this in other spaces, training us in ways that accept 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 the degree of noise that the internet provides for us, um, and actually shames a life of silence, or seasons of silence, seasons of solitude, right? It is undesirable to be um, alone and quiet. And this, I think, is especially challenging for people of faith, when we think about what kind of life we need to cultivate in order to be present to the living God, who is very easy to avoid or not notice when there's a lot of noise. or when we are constantly being driven hither and yon by whatever demands that email inbox is, shouting at us about.
What are then the liturgies that you would offer to disciple us into life in communion with God and communion with others? You've mentioned solitude, but once again, let's draw that out as a liturgy, a counter liturgy. What
Yeah.
are some of those counter liturgies?
So counter liturgy, this term that Jamie Smith used, I love that term. I love the way he talks about how it's not, just getting rid of the bad things, but actually taking on new practices that fill us up. And I think that's key for us because right now in our culture, especially with young people, increasingly, I think there's an awareness, right? There's an awareness that, hey, maybe all this technology isn't a great thing. And it can be easy to even feel shame about our digital habits, right? And be like, yeah, I know I shouldn't be on this app. I know I shouldn't, right? Like I know I shouldn't, right? And so I think one of the pitfalls we want to avoid is to just create another category of shame for Christians, right? To be like, oh, you're being bad because you're being online too much and so forth. And so I think the counter liturgy approach, right? This let's take on new practices that actually do fill us up is very compelling to me, right? Because it's saying there are good things that God already has for us that we just need to open ourselves up to, right? And so, very practically, I think of counter liturgies in two categories. I think in terms of cultivating sacred times and sacred places, right? And so the idea is maybe we can cultivate some kind of counter liturgy that protects us or creates freedom, actually, from all the demands, all the voices, right, that are constantly before us when we look at our screens. And so that can look like just, I'm a proponent of starting small. That can look like 15 minutes. 15 minutes in the morning, the first thing you do when you wake up, and just committing yourself to 15 minutes. I'm going to wake up and I'm not going to look at my phone or any device. I'm not going to read the news. I'm not going to find out what everyone texted me last night. I'm not going to, right? Just 15 minutes of quiet, right? To like open the shades, to smell the coffee, to see the face of the person that is in my home, right? Living with me, that's part of my household, to just breathe for 15 minutes, right? Before letting it all come in, right? And seeing that as sacred, right? This time when God is already present, but that I can be present to God, right? And we can, depending on where we're at, that might involve, maybe we read scripture, maybe we pray, maybe we journal, right? But it is about setting that boundary. Sacred places is about, again, thinking about being intentional about particular places that we want to kind of draw a line around and say, hey, in this space, it's going to be free of this noise and demands, and also a place to learn to be quiet, right? Or to be alone. And so that could look like a bedroom, it could look like a dining table, it could look like a place under a tree, right? I mean, it can be anywhere that we just set intentionally, right? As when I go there, I'm going to actually be free of all of these, right, voices and demands, and letting and being disciplined in keeping those boundaries, at least for a season, to give it a try. It can be hard in the beginning for many of us. It can be very challenging. Um, but seeing what fruit can be born out of that. One of the things I like talking about is thinking about these liturgies in terms of experiments. Experiments are, instead of kind of commitments or promises to oneself, because experiments never fail. You know, you can try for 15 minutes, and let's say you can't make 15 minutes. You only get to 5, right? And you have to look at your phone, right? Instead of thinking, oh man, what a failure I am. Like, I'm so weak-willed. What's wrong with me? Right? Seeing it as an experiment where you actually gather data. You say, oh, okay, I see I couldn't even last 5 minutes. Or like for me, I tried this. I've tried another practice is monotasking. Instead of doing multiple things, only doing one thing. So when I'm driving, I just drive, right? And so the first time I tried to just drive instead of listening to a podcast or calling a friend, it was terrible. I felt anxious. I was like breaking out in a cold sweat. I was very nervous. But that was data. That was data for me. That's then brought me to a place of prayer to say, okay, Lord, like, what's going on here? Why can I not even sit for 5 minutes? Help me to see what I need to see, right? And so I'm trying out these experiments in these liturgies, can become a part of the conversations and the journeys that we undertake in being a disciple of Christ, right? And trying to discern, right, what is it that God is wanting us to see.
Very, very helpful. But both the shift of mentality that you're describing, but also some of the very practical examples you've given in terms of creating sacred time and sacred space, places. This works for individuals. I can see that. Give us some imagination for what a community, whether it's a church or a family or a group of friends or maybe even a workplace. Like what can we do in that kind of environment setting to create these liturgies? I mean, can everything that works for an individual somehow be translated for a group?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think, you know, all of us can undertake individual liturgies, but in the end of the day, it will require the collective for substantive change to happen, right? It will require our friend groups, our communities, our families, our churches, our workplaces to commit to actually creating and being an environment that allows and celebrates the sacred time and the sacred place, right? Because it is, I mean, you know, every young person knows it's the hardest thing to be the only one without the phone, right? It would be really nice if there were just 4 or 5 other friends, right, that also didn't have the phone when you're 8 years old, right, in elementary school. And so it's the same thing, right? Then it's like, how do we create the classroom, or how do we create the workplace? How do we create the church community in which there is less expectation to be on the phone and actual celebration, right? To say, hey, let's take this time where we can set all that stuff aside, right? And be together. And that, I think, in those different contexts could look really differently. You know, a workplace and a church, you know, being a part of a church, obviously those are very different kinds of spaces. But I think for those who have responsibility or capacity to design those spaces and times, right, to actually cultivate those times of belonging, it can, I think there are lots of different ways we can think about it. So very quickly, you know, in terms of church spaces, you know, to be very honest, I haven't yet gone to, I don't get around to lots of different churches, so I should say that as a caveat, but I haven't gone to many churches where in the program it says, hey, let's let this be a tech-free time.
Mm,
Um, and I think, whereas I've gone to a synagogue where that was in the program, just
mm,
written in, right? And I remember thinking in the synagogue, oh, that's fascinating, right? There's
mm,
this real sense of like, oh, this space, let's just respect this space and our time just for now,
mm,
right? Um, so it can be kind of a light touch, kind of like just recommendation. This is just how we do things. Um, in the workplace, it can look like, I love what some of the companies in Silicon Valley actually are doing for their employees. It can look like, hey, when you go on vacation, we don't, a direct, like, we don't want you to be checking your email. We need you to rest.
mm,
And actually, anyone who writes you an email during your vacation, you can just delete it, right? That there's a company expectation, right? That is so. So no one feels penalized. No one feels like they have to keep up. It's those kinds of very overt, intentional, explicit, this is how we're going to do things, right? So that there isn't guessing. And that's part of the problem right now, I think, for us, is that we don't have etiquette. We don't know what the expectations are, right? With each other, within our organization. We don't have a Emily Post, right, telling us what the manners are, right? And so everything's just getting ratcheted up
mm,
to what is possible technologically. And what is possible technologically is 24/7,
mm,
right? Which is not, doesn't align with our human capacity, which is I need to sleep,
mm, mm,
right? I am an embodied person that needs to get out, right? There's a lot of things about our human health that does not align with the technological capacities, and that's where we're running into so many problems.
mm. Well, when we think of all these challenges, as we draw this conversation to a close, which has been so rich, when we think about these challenges and opportunities, what actually gives you hope for followers of Jesus?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that this is actually the time for the church,
Mm,
like this time, because the Christian heritage and theology actually is so filled with resources for people who are tired and exhausted and feel stuck with this life that our society is handing to us and our kids, right? And whether it's, a whole history of spiritual disciplines or contemplative traditions, right? Like there are aspects in which, um, in some way, there is an aspect of this is not something new under the sun,
mm,
right? An aspect of it, because there have been other aspects of society or culture that have also um, striven to the kind of dominance that technology has over us. So I think as the church, to me, we have the resources of a theology that celebrates our embodiment, that celebrates our relationality, that celebrates presence and something bigger than ourselves. And I think when we actually start listening to the people around us or even in ourselves, that's what we long for, right? That is what we are so hungry for. I think we just need to, as the church, do the work, right, of kind of pulling that up, and foregrounding it and trying to understand how it meets the needs of our time.
mm. Our guest on today's conversation has been Felicia Wu Song. I'm Walter Kim, and on behalf of us all, thank you, Felicia.